Welcome all to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is jam-packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with resources, events, programming, connections, and more. Thank you for joining this panel, Queer Kids, LGBTQ plus representation in middle grade and young adults. For more content related to this topic, you can check out Gender is a Construct, Writing Trans, Non-Binary, and GNC Representation from the 2021 conference. So to start things off, I'd like to hand it over to our wonderful group of panelists for introductions. Adiba, if you would like to start.
Hi, I'm Adiba Jaigirdar. I'm a former teacher and a YA author. I wrote The Henna Wars, Honey and Issues, Guide to Fake Dating, and I also have a historical coming up called A Million to One. I basically write books about queer brown girls who get to have their happily ever after.
Kalynn, if you would like to go next.
Okay, yeah, I'm Kalynn Bayron. I am a YA and middle grade author. I wrote Cinderella is Dead, This Poison Heart, and the forthcoming This Wicked Fate, and the forthcoming The Vanquishers. I write primarily about queer Black girls and women and queer Black families, and yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Courtney.
Hi, I'm Cortney Radocaj. I'm a literary agent with the Bel Castro Agency. I represent YA and adult fiction across horror, contemporary, sci-fi, and fantasy. And I love representing queer, disabled, neurodivergent authors across the board.
Hi, my name is Jesse Pohlman. I'm an author from Long Island, New York. I write primarily science fiction fantasy with a taste of the political involved. Pretty much all of my stories have involved LGBTQ plus characters to some extent, oftentimes them being protagonists. And it's really important to write these stories because it gives people a sense of identity.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for being here today. So to start things off, let's start off with the most important question, I think, for this panel. Why is it important to see queer representation in Kidlit?
Are we starting with me again?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Okay. Just wanted to check. So I think, queer representation in Kidlit is really important because when you are in that age category, when you're a tween or a kid, a tween, a teen, you're figuring out who you are and you are figuring out what the world is around you. And I think a lot of the times, if you don't really see diversity, and specifically if you don't see yourself reflected back in the books that you're reading or in the wider media that you're consuming, you have a very difficult time figuring yourself out because, if you are a kid who's queer, but you never see queer people in literature, you start to wonder if you are queer, if you can be queer, if being queer is actually like a real thing. I know that when I was a kid and, there were no Asian people who are queer in the books I was reading or in the media I was consuming, I believe that Asian people could not be queer, which is a ridiculous thought, but it's a thought that I had because I'd never seen it. So I just think, for non-queer people, it's important for them to see that, we exist, but specifically queer kids, they need to see their reality reflected back at them.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Queer representation in children's literature is incredibly important because all young readers deserve to feel seen. And, it's also important. There's also this need for young people who don't share these marginalized identities to see us in these kind of very complex, nuanced characters. It creates a culture of empathy and understanding, and it cultivates an understanding of community and kind of your place in the world. But overall, it's just all young people deserve to see themselves represented, and especially our queer youth who are really looking for those mirrors.
Yeah, building off of what both Adiba and Kalynn have said, I know that there's like a large subset of queer adults who didn't realize that they were even queer until they were adults, and I am one of those. Because it was never a thing where I grew up. I grew up in a small rural community and very religious community, and that kind of representation just wasn't there. And so I didn't even realize that it was an option until I was an adult. And so it ended up being this huge, like, life-shattering revelation. And having representation from the time kids are younger can help, like, prevent those kind of revelations, not necessarily, but it can help you accept who you are a lot earlier on and have it just be a piece of you from the get-go. And it's also important for cishet kids to see that across the board. Kalynn mentioned building a culture of empathy, and I think that's really important as well, because the more knowledge that kids have as they grow, the less things are going to feel weird or other. So even if they aren't queer, they're going to be a lot more accepting and understanding of their peers and of their family members who are queer. And instead of feeling weird when their friends and family come out, it can just be an, okay, cool. And they just continue accepting that person as they are. And I think that's really, really important.
I think you said a lot of the things that need to be said. I think the only thing I could really add is that many of us in the community, we knew at a very early age that we didn't have what would be considered conforming identities to what's considered normal by some people, sexuality. So we understood about ourselves something that if we don't see it in the fiction and the nonfiction we're exposed to as children, it's something that can be left behind in the, in some part of the back of your mind that doesn't understand until you're older and old enough to have been exposed to stuff, possibly even exposed negatively at the first time, which leads to all sorts of inner conflict that could have been spared had people simply just been taught this is okay.
Absolutely. I think those are all excellent points. So what do you feel is the difference between familiarizing kids with concepts of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, and advocating for particular stances about it? And then to add on to that, do you feel such a distinction is useful or necessary?
That's a difficult question. I don't necessarily think a distinction like that is necessary, at least personally. I think for me, when I'm trying to write LGBTQ representation into my work, I'm not necessarily thinking, what is my stance on this identity, or what is my stance on particular things that might go with being LGBTQ. I'm really trying to think about the characters that I'm writing and how I can be authentic to these characters, how I can be authentic to the story that I'm trying to tell. I think that all stories will naturally, take a stance. So obviously, if I am a queer person and I am writing a story centering queer kids, it's going to be a positive reflection of queerness, which is what I'm trying to do. So I think in that instance, it's obviously important to have that positive stance, because we want to always show kids, or even those who are not kids, who are reading Kidlit, that queerness is positive, and there is so much to celebrate and love about being queer, or having knowing queer people, and just our queer stories. So I personally don't think a distinction is necessary when I'm writing. I mostly just try to write my authentic characters, write my authentic stories, and whatever stance takes shape there is the stance that I am.
Yeah, I don't know that I necessarily have a distinction for that either in my as I'm kind of creating these worlds, but I do think there's a difference, that allowing kind of young people to know that these things exist is not pushing for or advocating other than just kind of a broadened worldview of the actual world that we live in, which is not the fantasy land of bigots who want this kind of binary gendered heteronormative environment. I think when I've had kind of this question before, and I like to kind of think about all the books that I read in school that were heteronormative, and how that absolutely, now with this kind of spate of book banning and things like that, that is absolutely advocating. They are absolutely advocating for a particular stance, especially if you're not allowing queer stories into the classroom or the library. And it's just kind of, it's funny that when the book is queer, now we're suddenly kind of worried about if there's an agenda. So I think the agenda all along has been anti-LGBTQIA+. And so I think naturally the work kind of pushes back against that. And it's only because we are trying to give our queer youth, and just our youth in general, more choices when it comes to storytelling. So I don't know that there's that I make that distinction as I'm writing, but I do think that sometimes there's this this kind of push and pull with are we advocating for something? Well, kind of. We're advocating for the normalization of queer life, because that is the reality for so many of us.
Yeah, I mean, Adiba and Kalynn have said pretty much exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of difficult to have a distinction between knowledge and familiarizing versus advocating, when a lot of people who have issues with advocating for queer kids and queer rights have an issue with us existing at all. And so the idea of just, okay, well, we're just trying to, present queer kids in media, like that shouldn't have to be an advocating stance, but it is, because there are people who have an issue with queer topics being talked about or us existing in the first place at all. And I don't really think in this time, at this point, it's possible to have one without the other, because exactly of what Kalynn said, and it's kind of difficult to familiarize kids with queer concepts if you're not going to do anything to help them as well. Like, it's one thing to talk about them, but also, if you're in school or your family is talking about this stuff, but then doesn't treat you as an entire human being because you're queer, like that sense doesn't exactly meld well either. So yeah, I definitely think at this point in time, having a distinction isn't really helpful at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to go back to what Kalynn said about when something is queer, there's an agenda attached to it. And I think that all art is political. You're making some kind of statement about how you think the world is or should be, how you think people are or should be treated. And whenever you try to advocate that particular people are perfectly normal and good and belong in our society and should be welcomed, the people who are against that are going to paint you as advocating for something or another. And that's a reactive thing. That's reductive. It's just a way to put somebody in a box and ignore their entire argument, because, hey, you're trying to paint this picture of LGBTQ plus kids getting taken care of in a loving family. And I don't know, I guess I'm losing my train of thought because it's just really hard to think about these days. Yeah.
What are some ways that you can explore queer concepts in middle grade and young adult fiction?
Well, I write young adults, so I can't speak for the middle grade part of the question. But for me, one of the ways that I try to explore queer concepts is I specifically try to write back to romance. So most of the stuff that I write is romance centering brown girls and particularly South Asian girls, because I am South Asian myself. And something that I really try to do is I look at the romance that has been published, or the romances that we watch a lot of the times in movies or TV shows, I really, grew up watching and reading a lot of romance, reading books like Mecca Bott's books, The Princess Diaries, the Mediator series, or, all of those like classic rom-coms, 10 Things I Hate About You, all of those. And, I was always such a big fan. I loved like all of the big like romantic moments. I loved all the romance that it encapsulated, all the tropes. But I guess, it frustrated me because we never saw that happening with two girls, and specifically with two brown girls or two, girls of color. And so when I write my books, I really try to think about all of this media that I have consumed since I was a kid, and how I can speak back to them, how I can incorporate them into my books, but also kind of make them my own. Because I think sometimes what we can do when we are writing or exploring queer concepts, we can be a little bit too on the nose about how we are taking something that is like heteronormative, taking a heteronormative trope and applying to queerness. We can't really do that. If we are, we need to adapt it to what the experience of queerness is. So that is kind of what I try to do, speak back to the romances that I read and watched, but also really try to adapt it to the specifically queer stories that I'm trying to tell.
Yeah, so in middle grade, and my first middle grade comes out in September. So as I was writing this story, I think what I liked the most about it was kind of seeing these stories where kids are forming these kinds of social connections to their peer groups. I love having my characters explore themes of empathy, of acceptance. I have found that writing middle grade, if we start from a place of acceptance, if we start from a place of empathy, it allows us to kind of build this really great foundation for a story that is queer normative without being preachy. It's just kind of built into the foundation of the story. I find that type of writing really rewarding. And in YA, I think I continue to kind of push those same themes, but as you age up, you have a little more autonomy, a little more room to explore the complexities of navigating a heteronormative world. And obviously in that space, we can go a little deeper into romantic feelings of self-discovery. And also we can kind of explore the power of platonic relationships, of friendships, their importance, because those are equally important. And we can look a little more into gender identity and the kind of weight of societal expectations. And ultimately, I think that it allows us to envision a future where we're not expected to carry those types of burdens with us all the time. So I think middle grade and YA space, they're really just amazing spaces to explore all of these different themes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think also, and again, I'm going to speak to YA because I don't represent middle grade, so I just do YA. So in YA in particular, a big thing with YA is pushing back against, the world as it is, and figuring out who you are in that world. I mean, there is that in middle grade as well, but like Kalynn said, like it's a little deeper, a little more complicated as you're coming into adulthood. I think that especially when it comes to things like gender expression and gender identity, that as well is something that can be really explored like in YA. As kids start realizing, if they haven't realized already, or if they did and they're coming into themselves as they're becoming young adults. A lot of kids, as they come into high school, they start dressing themselves in ways that fits what they want to look like more than what their family or what society expects them to look like. And I think that that's really important as well, to be able to express that, but also to be able to, have a character talk about their own gender identity in ways that they don't have to match how they present. And I think that that's important as well. And I think also because in YA, you're starting to talk about teenagers and sex is a thing, like as a teenager. And I think that that's important as well. And especially with identities, like asexuality and aromanticism, like I think that those are important things that you can explore and talk about in the YA sphere for sure.
Definitely. I love the point Cortney made about deciding how to dress yourself. I read somewhere that as we're growing up, we try on different identities like their clothes, but I don't think I agree with that, because a lot of times we know deep down something about who we are. We might not know what that something is, but we know something. Unfortunately, I know that I happen to be in the YA space as well, so I'm sorry I can't really give feedback to the middle grade ideas, but with YA, the coming of age story is a classic one. You know, you have the character who goes from being relatively in childhood to relatively in adulthood throughout the course of a tale. And, you know, it's just a thing where you've got to tie those things together. And YA, sorry, I'm having difficulties. When you're dealing with portraying how people are growing and becoming themselves in YA, you have to be, to a hint, gentle, but you can also get into those issues much more deeply.
Going back to tying back into what Adiba was talking about with the romance, how do you distinguish different types of attraction between characters, for example, platonic or romantic, if at all, in your stories?
I think for me, obviously, I am writing romance, or even when I'm not writing romance, I do emphasize romance in my stories. So I do think it's really important, especially maybe for queer characters, to have that differentiation between platonic relationships, familial relationships, and romantic relationships. I think there is often something that happens with queer stories, and maybe we can even, think about middle grade in this, because obviously in middle grade there's often a little bit less of an emphasis on romantic aspects. I think there's often this idea that a book can only be queer or LGBTQ plus if there is a romance that is at the center, and that the romance is what is making the book queer or making the characters queer. But at the end of the day, people are queer whether they are in a romantic relationship or not. So I think it's really important to kind of build that distinction, and especially because I think queer kids, they need to be able to understand that their friendships, their familiar relationships, which sometimes they might struggle with because they're queer, it's important to have those bonds, and they deserve to have those really important connections outside of their romantic relationships. So for me, when I'm writing my romances, I really try to build all of these relationships together, and just try to signify like what kind of distinguishes one from the other. So when I'm building a romance between two characters, it's kind of going back to those familiar feelings of like a crush, those little things that will tell a reader that there is something romantic about this, like the fluttering in your stomach, things like that, versus, a friendship, or like a best friendship, where you're literally telling like everything that is in your head to this person because they're your best friend. You can share everything about yourself with them. So I think just being aware of what these distinctions can be in relationships, and making sure that you are building all of those connections for your characters.
Yeah, everything Adiba just said. It's really about the connections between characters in middle grade and YA. I find that I'm looking around at my life, my friends, my family, my community, and kind of including characters with lots of different orientations, and I write them according to how they as individual characters kind of choose to express that orientation. I think that also in middle grade, the emphasis on these kinds of kind of those friendships that feel just so much a part of who you are when you're that age. Those friendships are so important, and sometimes those can bloom into these budding kind of romances, these that first crush, the first kind of maybe feeling like you want to be a little more than friends with someone, those first feelings, those are all, it's such a delicate kind of special kind of place sometimes. And so I try really hard in my middle grade because all my writing is queer. So whether I'm writing middle grade or short stories or YA or whatever, the emphasis is on queer people and queer youth. And so I find it really interesting to kind of explore that, especially in middle grade with these friendships, because I feel like when you're that young and you have these relationships that mean so much to you, and sometimes they fall apart or sometimes you grow apart, it feels like the end of the world. Like the impact is tremendous. And so you know, specifically as we're talking about different types of attraction, I think that there is a place for non-romantic attraction that is incredibly important in middle grade and also in YA, but especially in that middle grade, because we're not always having kind of that romantic element in these younger stories. So I feel like it's really important to include that, because we have people within the LGBTQIA+ community who are not necessarily looking for that kind of romantic attraction, but are looking for those relationships that are important and impactful to them. And that representation is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, when it comes to distinguishing between different types of attraction, I mean, that's definitely going to depend on the character themselves as well, just because everybody experiences those things differently. Everybody expresses those things differently. And that doesn't change like from, when you're talking about individual characters. I know Adiba had mentioned like the butterflies in the stomach. And I think that those physical sensations are an important way to distinguish platonic and romantic attraction, because that does tend to signal to readers, whether you're talking about queer characters or cis-het characters, that there is like some romantic feelings going on. That does tend to be like the distinguishing factor. But I also think that it's okay to have some confusion going on, because I think that a lot of queer kids have had the experience of, is this a crush or is this just my friend? Like, I don't know for sure. And I think that that's an experience that a lot of us have had. And that's something that especially, as a preteen and a young adult, that you're going to have to kind of figure out for yourself. And why representation is important, because it can help you figure out that stuff instead of having to go it completely on your own. I mean, even in cis-het relationships, it can be difficult to tell sometimes. I mean, ship wars are a thing for a reason. Like, people, ship people all the time that don't necessarily have like romantic attractions to one another in media. So I think that confusion sometimes is okay as well.
I think Courtney's definitely right about sometimes having a feeling and not being sure if it's for a friendship or for something more. As you're going through life, you build all sorts of different relationships, and you have all sorts of different types of love. You'll have love for your friends, you'll have love for your family, you'll have love for the people that you have romantic entanglements with. I think Adiba hit that absolutely on the head. There's different types of relationships. So as you're going through life, you have to just figure out, okay, is this person a friend? Is this person more than a friend? It's all about the type of connection that's made.
In your stories, is the character's awareness of their queerness a central point, or just simply a fact of the story?
I think it's different for different stories that I write, but most of the time it's almost a combination of both of those things. So for example, in my debut, my main character, she comes out in the first chapter to her parents. So obviously, the fact that she's queer and she's coming out is very central to the story in that aspect. But at the same time, the book is not really focused on her coming out, and that's not the most important thing about the book. The most important thing is just her kind of existing and trying to have a romance with this girl that she meets. So in that way, it's almost that, she's just queer, she exists, and she's just trying to live her life and have a romance. And I think, that's really important because for me, at least, obviously being queer is central to my identity, but at the same time, I'm also just a person that exists going about my life. And so that's kind of the kind of story that I personally like to write. And oftentimes it's also the kind of story that I personally like to read, because I think that queer kids, should be able to see central themes of queerness, which I think we all write about in a certain way in our stories. But also, it should be completely normalized that they're queer in these stories as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I have the same situation. I have in my debut, Cinderella is Dead. My main character, Sophia's queerness was the central theme. It was kind of, it's about her knowing exactly who she is and what she wants, but society is telling her that she can't be that and she can't do that. And so she's in direct conflict with this oppressive, homophobia that just dominates this society. But in This Poison Heart, which was my next novel, and in the follow-up, This Wicked Fate, Briseis, my main character is queer. And so are her moms. And so are like a dozen other characters that are in this story. And so there's never a question about it. It's clear, it's on the page. But it's on the page in the exact same way that, in a similar way that straight characters get to be on the page, which is without having to justify who they are in any way, shape, or form. It just kind of is what it is. And I think those stories are also incredibly important for when we're talking about inclusion and representation, because we need stories, of characters kind of pushing back against homophobia, but we also need queer normative stories that show us existing in a world that doesn't have a laser focus on our pain and our trauma, because we are allowed to exist that way as well. So I think it really just depends on the type of story.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree on all fronts of what you guys have said. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that both kinds of stories have their place. Because I mean, I think most queer people have experienced both sides of it. And sometimes you do need a story about what you're experiencing in that moment, especially kids, because they're probably in that moment of feeling like they need to push back against homophobic structures and things like that. And sometimes it's really good to have that and show that you can do that and that it'll be okay if you do that. And then other times, like Kalynn said, you don't want a story centered on your own pain and your own trauma, and you just want a world where you're accepted and there is no pushback. There's nothing to push back against. And I think both definitely have their place. And yeah, it just completely depends on what kind of story that you're wanting to tell and what you're wanting to focus on at that point.
So I would agree. It depends on the story. If it's a story about a queer person discovering their feelings and getting to live them for the first time, which is one of the major themes in one of my first books, yeah, absolutely, that's going to be a central point of at least some of the story. But you might have other tales that, they just happen to have a queer character, but it's not about their queerness because it brings about normativity to the situation.
What do you think, or do you think there is a difference between queer representation in the genre fiction, specifically science fiction fantasy, versus realistic fiction?
I don't write science fiction or fantasy, so I can't necessarily speak to that, but I can speak to, I guess, some of the challenges that come, or the positives and negatives that come with writing more realistic fiction, since I do write mostly contemporary stories. I think one of the big challenges that does come with writing realistic fiction is that you can write, for example, those stories that we're talking about, which make being queer very normative. So if I wanted to write a book where the characters weren't necessarily coming across any kind of homophobia, and they were just kind of getting to have fun, getting to fall in love, a lot of the times people will say this is unrealistic, which maybe in some cases, yes, it is a little bit unrealistic because, most of us in our lives, we have had to come across homophobia at one point or another in our lives. But I think a lot of times writing realistic fiction, we get trapped in this idea from readers telling us about what is realistic to our lives and what is unrealistic to our lives. And that can be really difficult. And you, as a writer, sometimes you feel like you're second guessing your own experiences, or you're second guessing what you are allowed to write, or how readers will react to the idea of realism in your books. So I think that is kind of one of the difficulties about writing realistic fiction. But at the same time, I think one of the positives of writing realistic fiction for me is that it all feels so like close. So, for me specifically, like I'm writing experiences that were close to me when I was a teen, writing books that are, set in Ireland, featuring Bengali characters, going to like secondary school, wearing their uniforms, having these experiences that I had when I was a kid, and then also kind of getting to have these like grand romances. So I think that can be like really, really nice because for me, it just feels so close. And I think for kids who are living these experiences or who are having similar experiences, they get to see it and they get to think like that could be my life. And so for them as well, it feels like something that they can achieve. When a lot of the times, I think queer kids feel like there's so much that they can't get to have or that they don't deserve to have. So it's kind of nice to be able to write those kinds of stories.
Yeah, I write fantasy and contemporary fantasy, and so for me, I don't know that they're really so far apart as to be kind of indistinguishable from each other. I think that people see queer people being happy or getting a happy ending as fantasy sometimes, and that realistic depictions of queerness mean pain or trauma or these very jarring experiences. And while that can be true, I think we all understand that can absolutely be true. I think that there's a lot of space in kind of sci-fi fantasy, in genre fiction to explore, like Adiba said, what's possible, to kind of think about what we want to see and what we wish we could have, also, I think that there's, I don't think that realistic fiction has to be limited either. I think that there's a lot of realistic fiction that really centers queer joy and these life experiences that we all kind of can relate to, going to school and, dealing with our caregivers and friendships and sometimes romantic relationships. It's those are all kind of human experiences, and so I think that there's that both realistic fiction and genre fiction, specifically fantasy, are really great spaces to kind of explore what representation looks like for us. And I think there's room for nuance. That I think that's what it comes down to. We don't have to be just one thing all the time, no matter what kind of space we're writing in. I think there's a lot of room to kind of explore and to have nuance and to have, fantasy stories and realistic stories that do center queer people and that are not, are not what these kind of outside voices are telling us these stories should be. These stories, especially as we're writing them, as we as queer people are writing them, we can put our experiences into these stories, and we can show that there are myriad ways in which we exist.
Yeah, these are all really great points, and I agree with everything that was said there. The thing that I'd like to add is I think that, and again, this is a trend, this is not like exclusive to just sci-fi and fantasy, but I think that especially in the past, sci-fi and fantasy has definitely had more queer-coded villains than realistic fiction has. And there's not a problem with villains being queer or queer coded. Like, I love a good villain and I'm okay with them being queer. But the problem is, especially like in decades past, that's been the only queer or queer coded character in the entire book or the entire series. And so then like that message is that queer is bad because they're the villain and nobody else is queer. So of course, like they're going to be bad, you know? And a lot of the time the villains weren't even like explicitly queer. They were just like queer coded, which also just, it doesn't feel great. And I think that is just because sci-fi and fantasy tend to have like larger than life villains. And so like people have pushed things farther than they would like in realistic fiction. But yeah, that's definitely something that I have seen like as a difference between the two. And again, not as exclusively a sci-fi fantasy thing. It's definitely happened in realistic fiction as well. But that's definitely something I've seen more in sci-fi and fantasy as I've gone on.
Great points. I mean, in science fiction fantasy, you kind of get to make up the rules to your own world. You can decide what's societally acceptable versus what isn't. It gives you a just tremendous diversity of tales with varying levels of stress and the nature of whatever relationships you have, right? You can have pretty much any sort of society you want. You make it up as you go. You have that freedom as an author. In a realistic setting, at least on modern day Earth, instead you get the opportunity to wrestle with the very real and difficult circumstances we have, as well as get to portray a picture of people that might not really exist, but might have a real impact on real people.
What do you think the future of queer lit will look like in both positive and negative ways?
I think that right now we're seeing a real rise in queer literature, which is really amazing to see. I think that we're also seeing a lot more diversity in queer literature. So we're seeing a lot of people from different parts of the queer umbrella getting to write their experiences. And we're also seeing, brown and Black people who are queer getting to write about their experiences. So I think it's really wonderful to be able to see this rise in not just queer literature, but in diverse queer literature as well. So I guess my hope is that we keep seeing that diversity. In terms of, I guess, negativity, is that like on the other side of that, I think that the rise of diversity within queer literature is still very, very slow, specifically when it comes to brown and Black stories. So I think, for example, Love, Simon, the movie, it came out in, can't even remember when. Does anybody remember the year it came out? It's been a good few years.
Yeah.
Yeah, like let's say 5 years. So Love, Simon, came out 5 years ago. And then recently we had Heartstopper come on Netflix. And I think these are both really amazing achievements. It's kind of, the first time that we've seen queer like YA in this way be in the mainstream, and also especially for something like Heartstopper be really accessible to queer kids, and both Heartstopper and Love, Simon, they did have it wasn't just the white queer experience. There were Black queer kids. There's just like a lot of diversity between both of these pieces of media. But despite Love, Simon, for example, having been out for a long time, we don't have an adaptation of like popular Black queer books. I think that's a problem. So, why has it been 5 years since this groundbreaking movie came out? And still the only adaptation that we can speak to after that is another show in the mainstream that was written by a white queer person. Yes, it may feature, diversity, it may feature Black and brown queer kids, but it was not a Black or brown creator who made it. So I think that's kind of the negative of it, that I think overwhelmingly the space is still white and queer. And I think we're often being told that this is the universal experience. And for Black and brown queer people, I think we're often told, wait your turn, like you're gonna get like the trickle down representation. Now we have Love Simon, now we have Heartstopper, and in a little while it'll be your turn. But we're kind of sitting here like, well, it's been years, so when is it actually gonna be our turn? So yeah, I think there's positives and there are negatives there.
Yeah, when it comes to TV or film adaptations of what we're getting, it's like you love to see things like Love Simon, and I love it, but I wonder where my stories are about queer Black women being with other queer Black women, queer brown girls getting to be with other queer brown girls. I think there's just a gaping hole there in what we're given, and just like Adiba said, we are being told to wait patiently, as if we haven't been waiting for so long already. But I think that we will see more queer stories, a push for the kind of variation in storytelling that cishet authors have always enjoyed. I think we'll get to see more queer representation in sci-fi, in horror, in paranormal. These are all things that I'm very excited about because I love a good vampire story. I love a good scary story. I want to see us in those spaces as well. And it's not hard at all to kind of imagine on the flip side what the future will look like because we've got all of these challenges that are already kind of manifesting, and homophobes are out in force and they're on a mission, but I don't like to focus too much on them. We're not going anywhere, and these stories are not going anywhere, and so they can move around or get run over. That's how I feel about it. We will continue to kind of create queer stories in spaces where queer youth can feel seen, and that is the only thing to me that really matters. That's why I became a writer, to kind of add my work to the conversation that we're having about representation and inclusion, and to show queer kids that they matter and that I see them, and that we will continue to put things out there for them. So positives, negatives, either way, I'm looking forward to what's to come, because I know that there's a fight there ahead of us. We're fighting it now, but I just think that I think that we will continue to push for inclusion and for diversity and for better representation.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that, queerness is becoming more of a thing like across literature. Like it's not as much of an outlier as it has been in the past, which is amazing. And it's also really, really great to see the different facets of queerness that are being represented. Like it's not just like gay or lesbian relationships. You're also seeing non-binary characters and ace and arrow characters, and just many, many different facets and flavors of queerness that we haven't seen in the past, because it was so hard just to get any queerness like in accepted at all, and now we're seeing a lot more versions of it, and I think that's really, really great. But going along with that, there are issues like both outside of the community and within the community of kind of policing and gatekeeping who is queer enough to write these stories and what is considered a queer enough story. So especially things like people who are, people and characters who are bi or ace, arrow, non-binary, like all the ones that aren't considered like part of the like mainstream like queer culture. There's definitely policing there. And I do worry about it becoming worse before it gets better. There's always feelings of competitions between authors, like especially marginalized authors, because there is a feeling of, even within communities, within the queer community, it's feeling, well, if that spot is taken from me, then I'm not going to get that spot, even though that's not that's how it feels, even if that's not completely true. It is to an extent. And so that's when you start to get like infighting between, and you know, within the community, which is heartbreaking to see a lot of the time. And so yeah, like I said, I just worry about that getting worse before it gets better, you know, when the amount of queer literature that is published is still restricted the way that it is. You know, I think if we get to a point where it isn't as restricted and there's just as much queer literature as there is cishet literature, then hopefully that problem will dissolve. But until then, I do worry about that for sure.
So like Adiba, I have a background in education, and maybe she can back me on this, but we try to start with the positive feedback first, right? That's kind of a thing we always say, hey, these are the things that are good about what's going on, and then here are the things not so good. This week has made it a little hard for me to do that. You know, for the good things, I think everything you've said is true. I think we need more diversity. I think hopefully that's on its way. I did a quick look around at the internet, and if you put in positive search terms like liberalization of queer law, you'll find that there are countries around the world where they're moving things forward. They're making queer people more legally protected. And that's all really important because that's where these stories might be needed the most. You know, if you go to a country that only just recently legalized sexuality between same-sex people, getting those stories in there to get people to understand and accept that we're kind of just like them is essential, because it's just going to make it so that these people over there are safe. But, you know, for the negatives, I mean, this week, the Supreme Court took aim at Lawrence versus Texas. For those who know what that is, it's terrifying, because in the ways other countries are going forward, ours seems to be going backwards, and it's very difficult to try to cope with that, let alone to fight it, but that's what we have to do.
So to end on a little bit of a lighter note after such a heavy topic, what are some good examples of queer rep in Kidlit that you are either familiar with or fond of?
I should start out by saying that I'm a little hesitant to really call anything good rep, because I think that representation can be so complicated, and what feels like good representation to me doesn't necessarily mean it is good representation for someone else, or that it resonates with someone else. You know, I think one of the great things about the rising diversity in queer literature is that we have more representation, and so more and more people can feel represented. So I think that's really wonderful. So I guess just to speak about some books that I have personally read and loved that I think have great representation. I love, well, first of all, I love Kalynn Bayron's Cinderella is Dead. I think it was honestly one of the first like fantasy books that I read that had like that sapphic representation. I love the way that it kind of spoke back to the patriarchy by centering, you know, Black girls. So I think, you know, that is like a wonderful book. And I'm always really happy to see it like do so successfully, and to see like Kalynn's career take off as well. Another book.
No crying.
Another book that I think does a really, really great job with queer representation is You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. I think it does such a fantastic job of taking something that is very quintessentially American, like the idea of prom. And I'm not American, but having watched like American TV and movies, I know that it's quintessentially American. I think it does such a great job of taking that quintessentially American idea of prom and just making it queer and like giving it to queer Black girls. I think that's really important. And I can't imagine what that representation meant to, you know, queer Black teens who are reading it. And on the, I guess the other side of that, a book by my friend, Ace of Spades by Farida Abike-Iyamide. I think it kind of does like almost the opposite of what You Should See Me in a Crown does, because You Should See Me in a Crown is like a rom-com, but Ace of Spades is very much speaking specifically to like institutionalized racism and the way that queer Black kids are specifically facing it, and the way that they almost have it on their shoulders to have to face that and break that down and speak back to it. So yeah, I think all of these three books, and I mean, there's a lot more, I could go on forever, but these three books, I think, do a really great job of showing different experiences of queerness.
Yeah, I of course I love the Hannah Wars. I hope I have made that absolutely clear on all my social media, but there, like Adiba was saying, representation can be, so much determined by what we as individuals, are looking for. And so there is that kind of disclaimer there. But I'm trying to think. I love Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. I think that and I loved the reception of that story. It really felt like something kind of new and fresh, and Aiden's writing is just amazing. And so that's one of my favorites. I'm trying to think. Anything by Case and Calendar, and Felix Ever After was one of those books that just kind of sticks with you, and anything by Julian Winters. Like, everything's going out of my head right now, but I think that the key is the number of stories that we're getting. If we can have more queer stories, you can find something that works for you. If this specific thing didn't work for you, you can have another option. And sometimes in publishing, we run up against this issue of like, okay, well, we have one, kind of queer Black rom-com, so we're good there. We don't need to kind of, add more, but we do. We need, because if you're not feeling the representation in this specific rom-com, you can have another option that also, centers queer people. So I just think that we need more and more and more. But, Aiden Thomas, Case and Calendar, Julian Winters, these are some of my favorites. But there are, and any, of course, Leah, and there's, and if I can, kind of take a minute to like hype myself, like I write queer stories that feature queer Black girls, and they offer one kind of avenue for representation, and it's not meant to be all things to all people. But I just think that there's just so many. I could probably talk for an hour about book recs, but we need more and more choices. But those are some of my faves.
Yeah, Cemetery Boys is also on my little list that I've prepared for this panel here. I really loved that book, like, just pushed back against such binary, rigid systems like that, because I love seeing representations of gender that like push back against things like that. I thought that was really, really great. I also really loved Kiss Number 8 by Colleen A.F. Venable. It's a graphic novel. That book was just filled with messy queers, and it made my heart very, very happy to see teens allowed to make mistakes and be, and to be messy and to not have everything figured out and to be making mistakes as they figure it out, because I feel like that's just very, very important for teens in particular to see. Saw Kill Girls by Claire Legrand is another one that I absolutely adored. I loved seeing ace representation in there, and in a healthy way that wasn't like a deal breaker for the character's partner. It wasn't something that was it just wasn't something that ended a relationship. It was something that was accepted and was okay, and especially within the context of a romantic relationship. I thought that was really, really great to see.
Yeah, I love the point that representation can be subjective. I love the point that if something didn't work, try something else. Don't just assume, well, this one didn't work, so they all don't work. And I'm going to contradict myself by saying I really only have one suggestion, because I guess it's the one that helped me. It's the Last Harold Mage trilogy by Mercedes Lackey. It's about a young man who is denied information that being gay is a thing that can happen, but he eventually figures it out and has his first love and has his first tragedy and goes through his life and experiences life in a setting where it's different rules than ours, but not entirely different rules than ours. So that's why I would recommend. It's a young adult read. It's definitely got some dark stuff. It's not perfect representation. It's not idealistic representation, but it is an approach to it that maybe it's just because it was early in my life that I got to it, but it did help me out significantly.
I want to thank you all so much for being here today and having this very important discussion. Can you let our audience know where they can find you and what you have coming up in store?
Yeah, so I have a new book out December of this year. It's something a little bit different from me. It's a historical, even though it still has a central sapphic romance in it. It's called A Million to One, and it's basically a sapphic heist set on the Titanic. And you can find me on Twitter at Adiba_J, on Instagram at DIBS_J, or my website, which is adibajaigirdar.com.
I am at Kalynn Bayron on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, even though I'm awful at TikTok, so go over there with caution. I have a lot of stuff coming up. So just very quickly, the sequel to This Poison Heart, it's called This Wicked Fate, comes out June 21st. It's a YA contemporary fantasy. And then my debut middle grade comes out September 20th. It's called The Vanquishers. It's a vampire story. And next week I've had the privilege of being involved in an anthology edited by Sandra Mitchell. Out There comes out next month. I said next week. Next month. And yeah. And also another anthology edited by Patrice Caldwell comes out in September. It's called Eternally Yours. So all of that information is also on my website, which is KalynnBayron.com.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Cortney Radocaj, my website, which is just CourtneyRadocaj.com, or the Belcastro site, which is belcastroagency.com. For promo stuff, my clients have things coming out. There's City of Shattered Light, which came out in October by Claire Wynn. That one is a bisexual YA sci-fi cyberpunk setting. It's absolutely wonderful. And then in July, Jessica Kara has A Furry Faux Pas coming out. And that one is a YA contemporary set around a furry convention and dealing with hoarder mom at home and setting boundaries and things like that. So yeah, definitely check out those two.
Okay, so my name is Jesse Pohlman. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for being here. You can find me on Twitter at jpohlmanwriting.com. My website is jpohlmanwriting.com. I have an Instagram. I have a TikTok, I don't know. As far as things I have coming up, my books are at the editors right now, so dealing with that. And yeah, it's a good experience. So thank you all again for having me. It really was educational.
Thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the WriteHive 2022 conference.